Power, wealth, secrets. In the grand halls of New York during the Gilded Age, nothing was more dangerous than ambition. Episode 9 of the Gilded Age Season 3 isn't just another chapter, it's the moment where masks start to slip. Alliances begin to crack, and the battle between old money and new money reaches its sharpest edge. And on the official Gilded Age podcast, the creators pull back the curtain to reveal what we didn't see on screen. Asterisk. The Gilded Age was a period of glittering wealth and deep divides. In the late 19th century, New York City became the stage for one of history's most dramatic clashes, the old aristocracy of established families versus the bold newcomers who built fortunes overnight. This is the world Julian Fellows brings to life in the Gilded Age. Every ball, every dinner party, every whispered conversation is a battle for power, reputation, and survival. Episode 9 of Season 3 lands us right in the middle of that storm. But what makes this story even more fascinating isn't just what happens on screen, it's the insight, detail, and history hidden behind it. That's exactly what the official Gilded Age podcast delivers. Hosted with elegance and curiosity, it dives into the making of each episode, giving us voices from behind the camera and inside the writing room. It's not just a recap, it's a map to the layers of meaning we might have missed. In this episode of the podcast, the creators talk about how Episode 9 becomes a turning point. It's where ambitions grow sharper, relationships face their breaking points, and the struggle between tradition and progress refuses to be ignored. The podcast reminds us that every scene isn't just drama, it's a reflection of real history, of a society transforming under the weight of industry, politics, and human desire. To understand why this podcast matters, we need to pause and think about what the Gilded Age really represents. It's not just a costume drama with pretty gowns and grand staircases, it's a mirror of ambition. The Vanderbilt-inspired mansions, the Astor-like families clinging to their fading authority, and the restless entrepreneurs reshaping the future. All of them are symbols of change. And when the podcast takes us behind the velvet curtains, we see the decisions that shape how history and fiction meet. But what's most exciting about Episode 9 is that it doesn't just tell a story, it builds tension for what's to come. It makes us question who will rise and who will fall, who will cling to their gilded world and who will be crushed by it. This is why the podcast is essential. It turns every episode from a drama we watch into a history we feel. The podcast's hosts and guests describe how hard it is to capture the complexity of this era. Costumes aren't just fabric, they're statements of identity. Dialogue isn't just conversation, it's strategy. Even the smallest gestures on screen, like a glance across a ballroom, are loaded with meaning. When Episode 9 pushes characters to confront their greatest risks, the podcast shows us how deliberate each of those choices was, and this is where the beauty lies. The Gilded Age isn't simply about New York's elite, it's about what power does to people, about how society rewards some and destroys others. And in Episode 9, those themes rise to the surface more clearly than ever. Listening to the podcast, you realize that the drama unfolding isn't distant or outdated. It's the same struggle we recognize today between tradition and progress, between those who hold power and those desperate to claim it. That's what makes this podcast such a powerful companion to the show. It slows down the pace of the story and lets us look closer. It lets us savor the richness of the world, not just in terms of wealth, but in terms of storytelling. And as we prepare to dive deeper into Episode 9, the podcast reminds us that history isn't just about the past, it's about the present choices we make, the values we defend, and the ambitions we chase. Asterisk. Episode 9 of the Gilded Age Season 3 does not walk its storms into the drawing rooms and back alleys of New York with all the weight of ambition pressing against fragile social walls. At this point in the season, the foundations laid in earlier episodes are no longer just hints of conflict. They've grown into full confrontations. This is the hour where masks slip, where whispered threats become spoken truths, and where every character must reckon with the choices they've made. The episode opens with tension already simmering. The air feels charged, not with celebration but with unease. Characters who once appeared untouchable begin to face cracks in their carefully built facades. The world of the old elite, the families who've ruled New York society for generations, find themselves squeezed tighter than ever by the rise of the new industrial fortunes. The grand halls that once echoed with certainty now tremble under the weight of uncertainty. Every glance across a ballroom, every pause in a conversation, feels like a duel fought without swords. One of the central storylines unfolding in Episode 9 is the War of Legitimacy. The old families cling to traditions, names, and rules that once made them untouchable. They throw balls, enforce guest lists, and guard their reputations like fortresses. But the newcomers, those who built empires of steel, railroads, and industry, refuse to wait for permission. They have money, they have influence, and they are ready to claim space that the old guard swore would never belong to them. Episode 9 heightens this battle, not through explosions of violence, but through sharp social maneuvers. A single denied invitation carries the same weight as a political scandal. A handshake at the wrong dinner table becomes the spark for a war, but the social battlefield is not the only one in play. Romantic tensions have also reached their peak. Episode 9 doesn't treat romance as soft or decorative, it treats it as a weapon. Every union is a bargain, every courtship is a transaction, and every whispered promise of love is shadowed by questions of power. Characters who long for personal happiness must decide if that happiness is worth the risk of losing everything. Else, for some, love becomes an anchor in a storm. For others, it is the very storm that threatens to sink them, and then, of course, there are the betrayals. Episode 9 is woven with threads of deceit, sometimes subtle, sometimes sharp. Characters who have danced carefully along the edges of loyalty and self-interest are finally forced to step one way or another. A friend may turn out to be an enemy in disguise. A rival may offer an alliance with strings that cut deeper than chains. The episode reminds us that in this world, trust is the rarest currency, and betrayal is the one coin everyone knows how to spend. What makes Episode 9 especially gripping is not just the drama itself, but the sense that time is running out. With only one episode left in the season, the stakes have never been higher. Every storyline feels like a fuse racing toward an explosion. We watch as characters gamble with their reputations, their fortunes, and their hearts, knowing that not everyone will survive the blast. The choices made in Episode 9 are irreversible. Once spoken, words cannot be taken back. Once crossed, lines cannot be uncrossed. The characters know it, and so do we. The podcast episode tied to this chapter of the show leans into these tensions beautifully. The creators explain how every scene in Episode 9 was designed like a chess move. The placement of characters at a dinner table, the choice of who enters a room first, even the tilt of a hat or the length of a pause in dialogue, all of it was deliberate. The podcast hosts pull apart the episode like a puzzle, showing us how each piece connects to the larger picture. What seems like casual detail on screen is revealed to be intentional strategy. It's not just storytelling, it's architecture. Listening to the podcast, we also learned that Episode 9 was one of the most challenging of the season to produce. It required balancing multiple storylines while keeping the audience focused and invested. There are no filler moments in this episode. Every scene carries weight. The cast spoke about how exhausting yet rewarding it was to perform scenes filled with so much emotional complexity. For them, it wasn't about simply reciting lines, but about embodying people caught between worlds, between duty and desire, between history and the future. One striking detail the podcast reveals is the use of silence in Episode 9. In a show full of lavish dialogue and eloquent speech, silence becomes a weapon. There are moments where nothing is said, but everything is understood. A character looking away from another, a pause before answering a question, a breath held too long. These moments carry more power than words. They tell us that the most dangerous things are often unspoken. The podcast reminds us that this was intentional, that silence can be louder than any declaration of war. Another detail that stands out is the way Episode 9 handles location. The Gilded Age is famous for its grand sets, mansions with glittering chandeliers. ballrooms filled with polished marble, and dining rooms overflowing with silver. But in episode 9, the podcast explains the spaces themselves become characters. A room is not just a room, it's a battlefield. A staircase is not just a staircase, it's a stage for power. Who stands at the top and who remains below matters as much as the dialogue. The creators share how much care went into designing these spaces to reflect the invisible lines of class and ambition, but perhaps the most gripping part of episode 9 is the sense of impending collapse. The audience can feel it. The season is nearing its end, and the fragile structures of society can no longer hold steady. Will the old guard finally break under the weight of change? Will the new money families cement their power, or will their ambition destroy them from within? These are the questions episode 9 forces us to ask without yet giving us the answers. It is an episode built on tension, a storm gathering at the edge of sight. The podcast episode leaves us with reflections that deepen the impact. It reminds us that the Gilded Age is not just a story of the past, but a story that echoes into our present. The fights over wealth, recognition, legitimacy, and love are still here, just in different costumes. Episode 9, in particular, resonates because it shows us that no empire, whether built on old traditions or new fortunes, is immune to cracks. Change is inevitable, and those who resist it may find themselves crushed beneath it. And so, episode 9 doesn't simply move the story forward, it sharpens it. It forces every character to the edge of decision. It makes us hold our breath as we wonder, who will step into the future and who will be left behind in the past? The beauty of the official Gilded Age podcast is that it doesn't just tell us what happened in episode 9, it shows us why it matters. It turns drama into detail, giving us a tour through the hidden layers of the show. Listening to the hosts and creators talk, you realize that every gesture, every costume choice, every word of dialogue was shaped with purpose. Episode 9 may feel like a wave of emotions crashing together on screen, but in the podcast, it's revealed to be a carefully choreographed dance. One of the first insights the podcast offers is about the architecture of power. In episode 9, the placement of characters in a room was as significant as the lines they spoke. The podcast explains that the director deliberately staged scenes to visually communicate hierarchy. For example, when a character sits at the head of a table, their dominance is emphasized. When another character lingers at the edge of a ballroom, it shows their exclusion. These choices might pass unnoticed by the casual viewer, but the podcast makes them shine like secrets finally spoken aloud. Costumes also become a subject of deep conversation. In episode 9, wardrobes are not just beautiful gowns and tailored suits, they are weapons. The podcast highlights how new money characters often wear fabrics that shimmer and stand out, a reflection of their hunger to be seen, while the old guard leans toward restraint, wearing outfits heavy with tradition. A single jeweled pin or feathered hat can say more than a page of dialogue. The costume designer, interviewed in the podcast, explains how every color choice was tied to emotion: red for defiance, black for mourning, gold for ambition. When we see a character walk into a room in episode 9 dressed like a flame, it isn't fashion, it's a declaration of war. Another fascinating detail comes from the discussion of silence as strategy. The podcast reveals that episode 9 was scripted with pauses that were just as important as speeches. In a society where words could ruin reputations, silence often spoke louder. The hosts describe how actors trained themselves to use glances, half smiles, or averted eyes to convey hidden emotions. One guest even shared that shooting these moments was more exhausting than delivering long monologues because holding back required more discipline than speaking freely. Episode 9, they say, is full of these silent battles, and once you notice them, you can't unsee them. The podcast also dives into the challenges of balancing multiple storylines. Episode 9 juggles romance, betrayal, business rivalries, and shifting social alliances. The writers admit in the podcast that this episode was one of the trickiest of the season. Too much focus on one plotline and the others would feel abandoned. Too little and the tension would evaporate. Their solution was to design the episode like a symphony. Each storyline was treated as an instrument, sometimes rising, sometimes falling, but always contributing to the larger harmony. Listening to the creators describe this process gives you a deeper appreciation for how carefully the episode was constructed. Behind the scenes, the podcast reveals stories that make episode 9 come alive in new ways. For example, one actor shares how a key emotional scene took over a dozen takes, not because of mistakes, but because the director wanted to capture the perfect balance between vulnerability and restraint. Another detail we learn is that a ballroom scene was lit with real candlelight, not just electric bulbs, to give authenticity to the flickering shadows. The podcast explains how these choices weren't just aesthetic, they shaped the actors' performances. When you're surrounded by flickering firelight instead of sterile studio lamps, the world feels more real, and so do the emotions. A major theme of episode 9 is transition, the crumbling of the old order and the rise of the new. The podcast unpacks how the writers used visual and narrative contrasts to emphasize this. We see characters standing in front of crumbling mansions, symbols of a fading era. We see others stepping into new constructions, symbols of ambition and progress. The hosts explain that these were not coincidences. Every shot was meant to remind the audience that change was not just coming, it was already here, but the podcast doesn't stop at analysis. It connects the dots between the past and the present. One guest historian draws parallels between the financial battles of the Gilded Age and the economic shifts of today. Just as industrial fortunes disrupted old aristocracies in the 19th century, tech and modern billionaires disrupt old financial powerhouses now. The struggles in episode 9 are not just historical, they are timeless. Hearing this makes the drama on screen feel urgent, not distant. The podcast also explores character psychology. Take, for instance, the way ambition corrodes relationships. The writers admit that episode 9 was intentionally written to push characters to their emotional breaking points. One character, long seen as unshakable, shows cracks in their armor. Another, often underestimated, makes a bold move that changes the game. The actors, in their podcast interviews, reveal how much research went into embodying these shifts, reading journals of real Gilded Age figures, studying letters, and even practicing mannerisms from the period. These layers of preparation remind us that the characters are not caricatures. They are living echoes of real people. What's most striking about the podcast's breakdown of episode 9 is its insistence that nothing is accidental. A painting in the background of a dining room scene, chosen for its symbolism. A staircase where a confrontation happens, designed to emphasize imbalance, one character elevated, the other forced to look up. Even the choice of flowers on a table reflects the underlying emotional tone. When the podcast peels back these details, it transforms the episode from a drama we consumed to an artwork we studied. There's also a sense of vulnerability in the podcast. The creators admit that episode 9 scared them, not because of technical challenges, but because of its emotional weight. They knew this was the episode that would test the audience's patience, loyalty, and investment. Too much subtlety and viewers might miss the stakes. Too much drama, and it would feel melodramatic. Finding the balance was like walking a tightrope. Hearing this honesty makes you appreciate the courage it takes to tell a story that big and that fragile at the same time. In its final moments, the podcast breakdown circles back to the core of the Gilded Age. It's a story about people trapped between what they want and what society allows. Episode 9 exposes that tension more brutally than ever. The insights from the podcast remind us that while we watch ballrooms glitter and mansions shine, beneath the gold lies fear, hunger, and fragility. The podcast takes us by the hand and says, "Look closer. Do you see what's really happening here?" By the time the episode ends, we realize that episode 9 isn't just a stepping stone toward the finale, it's a masterpiece of tension, crafted with precision and depth. And the podcast is the lens that reveals just how much brilliance was hidden in plain sight. Episode 9 of the Gilded Age Season 3 is not only about what happened, it's about what it means. The surface story is dazzling: glittering ballrooms, whispered betrayals, sudden alliances, broken romances. But underneath, This episode carries themes that echo beyond the 19th century into our own lives and our own struggles. When we peel away the lace, the marble, and the chandeliers, what remains is a story about power, ambition, sacrifice, and change. The first theme that rises from episode 9 is the fragility of power. The old families of New York who once sat comfortably at the top of society now stand on trembling ground. Their authority was built not just on wealth, but on reputation, on names that commanded respect. But as the new money empires grow bolder, those reputations begin to lose their shine. The episode shows us that power, no matter how secure it seems, can be undone by time. It asks a question we all recognize today. How long can any dynasty last before the world changes around it? The podcast highlights this fragility by pointing out small details. The way an established hostess glances nervously at a guest list, the way an old mansion begins to look shabby next to a new construction. These are not accidents, they are reminders that every throne eventually wobbles. Power, episode 9 tells us, is never permanent. It is borrowed, not owned. Another central theme is ambition as both salvation and poison. The new money characters in episode 9 are bold, unapologetic, and determined to seize what the old guard refuses to grant them. Their ambition fuels their rise, but it also puts them in constant danger. Ambition opens doors, but it also creates enemies. One character's hunger for recognition threatens to isolate them from the very people they hope to impress. Another risks losing love in the chase for acceptance. The theme here is sharp. Ambition can build empires, but it can also burn bridges. The podcast deepens this idea by revealing how the writers intentionally framed ambition as a double-edged sword. They wanted the audience to admire the courage of these characters while also fearing the cost. We see reflections of this in our own time, when ambition drives innovation but also sparks division. Episode 9 forces us to ask, is ambition worth it if it leaves us standing alone? The theme of identity versus society also shines in episode 9. Characters struggle between who they are and who the world demands them to be. Some long for freedom to love who they wish, to live without the weight of tradition, but society's rules choke them. Others cling desperately to those rules because without them, they fear they will vanish into irrelevance. Episode 9 places these conflicts at the forefront. In one scene, a character hesitates before stepping into a room, torn between personal desire and public duty. In another, someone risks reputation for a fleeting taste of honesty. These are not just dramatic moments, they are mirrors of the human struggle to balance self with society. The podcast reveals how carefully these identity struggles were crafted. The writers studied real diaries and letters from the Gilded Age, where individuals often confess the tension between private life and public image. By weaving those struggles into episode 9, the show reminds us that history is not distant, is human. Every person, whether in 1880 or 2025, knows the pain of hiding who they are for the sake of acceptance. A quieter but powerful theme in episode 9 is silence as survival. The podcast emphasized this earlier, but thematically, silence isn't just a storytelling device, it's a statement. In this world, what you don't say can protect you as much as what you do say. Silence shields secrets, masks vulnerability, and buys time. But it also carries risk. Remaining silent means watching opportunities slip away. It means letting others control the story. Episode 9 uses silence to remind us that survival often requires restraint, but progress demands voice. This resonates deeply when we think about our present world. How many times do people remain silent out of fear of rejection or out of loyalty to traditions that no longer serve them? Episode 9 forces us to confront the cost of that silence. The podcast's insight that silence is louder than words turns from a production note into a philosophical reflection. Perhaps the most universal theme of episode 9 is change as inevitability. The Gilded Age itself was a time of transition, industrial revolutions, shifting wealth, political upheaval. Episode 9 captures this turbulence with precision. The old families are fighting to hold on, the new families are fighting to break through, and everyone feels the earth shifting beneath their feet. No one is safe because no one can stop the tide of change. The podcast highlights how this theme was embedded into the very design of the episode. Mansions are shown not as permanent monuments, but as fragile structures built on sand. Relationships crack as quickly as fortunes rise. Characters who resist change are portrayed with sympathy, but also with a sense of tragedy. They are clinging to a world that no longer exists. In contrast, those who embrace change are portrayed as bold, but also reckless, because change itself offers no guarantees. This theme speaks to us now more than ever. We live in an age of rapid transformation, technological, social, political. Like the characters in episode 9, we are forced to decide, fight against the tide, or ride with it. The brilliance of the episode, and the podcast's breakdown of it, is that it doesn't give us easy answers. It simply shows us that change will come, whether we're ready or not. Another subtle theme is sacrifice as the price of survival. Every character in episode 9 is forced to give something up, whether it's love, pride, loyalty, or even safety. The podcast reveals that the writers wanted this episode to feel like a crossroads. No one can move forward without leaving something behind. Some sacrifices are small but painful, like letting go of a friendship. Others are devastating, like abandoning a dream. Sacrifice becomes the currency of progress, and episode 9 is the market where it is spent. This theme resonates because it reflects reality. Progress always demands cost. Success always requires trade. Episode 9, through its storylines and conflicts, reminds us that nothing in life, whether in 80 or today, comes without sacrifice. Finally, there is the theme of legacy. Episode 9 is haunted by the question of what will endure. Old families cling to their names, desperate to pass them on. New families build fortunes not only to enjoy them, but to ensure they are remembered. Characters weigh their actions not just for the present, but for how they will be judged in the future. The podcast draws attention to this, pointing out how often characters speak not only for themselves, but for their children, for their houses, for their family lines. Legacy is not just memory, it is immortality, and yet the episode also questions whether legacy is worth the struggle. If the price of being remembered is misery in the present, is it truly worth paying? Episode 9 offers no clear answer, but the tension of that question lingers long after the credits roll. The podcast ends by reminding us that these themes' power, ambition, silence, change, sacrifice, legacy are not just historical curiosities. They are alive in us. The Gilded Age may be gilded in gold, but it is made of the same fears and hopes we carry today. Episode 9, with its carefully layered conflicts, asks us to look inward. Where do we stand between tradition and progress? What are we willing to sacrifice for ambition? How will our legacies be written when our time is past? This is why the Gilded Age is more than a period drama. And this is why the official Gilded Age Podcast is more than a recap. Together they remind us that history is not behind us, it is within us.